Good evening. Thanks everyone so much for coming out this evening. It's the first of the GSD lectures hosted by the Department of Landscape Architecture. I'm Charles Waldheim. It's my pleasure to serve as the Irving Professor and Chair of Landscape Architecture here at the Harvard GSD. On behalf of our Dean, Mohsen Mostafavi, welcome. Thanks for being here. It's also a pleasure to welcome you to the 2014 Sylvester Baxter Lecture. And for those of you who haven't followed this, Sylvester Baxter was a Boston area writer and advocate for the field that came to be known as planning in the early decades of the 20th century. Baxter was, among other things, first secretary of the Massachusetts Metropolitan Park Commission, and along with Charles Eliot and a few other people, were a part of a cohort, a group that argued for the development of the Metropolitan Park System here. And so annually we give a Baxter lecture with respect to planning. I also want to acknowledge and extend my gratitude to candidate GSD, among many other people in the school. Thank you for all of your work over the last several weeks in advance of the evening. Some have claimed that the landscape architect is the urbanist of our age. You may have heard me say something quite like that from this podium in the past. For some, this represents a return to the origins of landscape architecture or an articulation of an expanded ambition and scope of work for that professional. The practices and discourses of landscape as a form of urbanism have raised a range of questions, and most notably, for our purposes this evening, we're interested in the status and the role of urban planning relative to these developments. While, of course, it's been well described that city planning emerged from the nascent urban aspirations of landscape architecture in the early decades of the 20th century, the recent reassertion of landscape architects in that role raises a whole range of questions, some of which we've dealt with over the recent past. For those of you who were with us a year ago in the fall, Robert Hammond came from New York to talk about his role in the High Line, for example. And in this regard, I thought it would be timely to convene a conversation about another model of landscape-driven development, the waterfront of Toronto. This evening's talk allows us a chance to continue this line of thinking, particularly looking at an example that I think of as a third way in comparison to the other two primary venues for the Landscape Urbanist Project, that is the kind of state-centered capitalist work in East Asia on the one hand, or the US model, philanthropy, donor culture-driven, strong mayor culture associated with New York's Bloomberg or Chicago's Daily. For me and for many of my colleagues, Toronto's relatively weak mayor system and its absence of more on that later this evening. I can tell you we'll return to that topic in the discussion. We find a third model in which I find, and many of my colleagues have found, the aspirations to a leavened, culturally progressive, ecologically healthful, and maybe even socially just city is available to us, not that far afield. In that context, a series of what I now think of as canonical design competitions of the past several years, including but not limited to the Central Waterfront competition or the Lower Don River, Toronto has been really at the forefront of these developments, both on the design side but also on the planning process. This evening's speakers are, I think, uniquely qualified to situate that work and contextualize it for us. Christopher Glaisek is Vice President of Planning and Design for Waterfront Toronto. Prior to this role, Glaisek has served as Vice President of Planning, Design, and Development for the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation, where he was instrumental in innovative integration of planning and design efforts. Prior to that role, he was central in the design and planning work of the New York's 2012 Olympic bid. In each of these various roles, I think of Chris as somebody who has been engaged in a rapprochement between design and planning, and over the last decade he's been among, I think, the most insightful, bold, and innovative planners working in North America. Bruce Kuwabara chairs the design review panel for Waterfront Toronto. He's also a founding principal of Kuwabara, Payne, McKenna, Bloomberg Architects, affectionately known as KPMB. Kuwabara is among North America's most significant practicing architects. He and his firm have produced over the last several years what I think of as among the more compelling examples of architecture and urban ensembles. Full disclosure, I lived for a time in a development of the ballet school in Radio City in Toronto, and I think of it as among the most convincing pieces of urbanism in North America in recent memory. The next time you're in Toronto, I encourage you to visit the Bell Lightbox, which is now home to the Toronto Film Festival, among other things. The other thing that I wanted to say this evening is that I in my own way, as a Canadian citizen, I think of Kuwabara as a form of Canadian royalty. I think that somewhere in Buckingham Palace there's a file drawer, and in that there's a label that says Commonwealth, and there's a file that says Canada. And it begins with Governor General, and if you go down that sheet of paper, at some point you'll find Bruce Kuwabara's name. Bruce is, among other things, Officer of the Order of Canada for shaping, quote, our built landscape in lasting ways. And I think his commitments to architecture and urbanism and landscape transcend a specific disciplinary framework. He has been recipient of virtually every national award that Canada has to give, and has most recently been named chair of the board of the Canadian Centre for Architecture. Please join me in welcoming Chris Glaisek and Bruce Kuwabara.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. I want to thank Charles for inviting us and hopefully give you some insight as to what's going on in this obscure little foreign city known as Toronto, which sounds like some of you know something about, thanks to Charles. I have been leading the planning and design work there for about 8 years now, and I think there's been a lot of lessons learned as to how to do things, and some exciting projects, some of which have been realized, some of which haven't. But I'd like to give you a little survey of them and share some of my insights about it. The first thing is that the organization that I work for is called Waterfront Toronto, and it is a government-owned development corporation. It's a model that's used a lot in the United States as well as in Canada, so it's basically a private development company that's wholly owned by the government. In our case, all 3 levels of government own us, so we have lots of political masters. We have $1.5 billion worth of public funding that was pledged to us. It does not sit in a bank account somewhere. You have to apply for it on a project-by-project basis, which creates a need for an organization that has 70 people, I think about 35 of whom do nothing but finance and securing government grant money for us. And we have a broad revitalization mandate. We were created very much with the idea of not simply selling off the waterfront land that's owned by the public, but trying to develop it in such a way that it would do more, that the sum of the parts, I guess, would be, or the whole would be greater than the sum of the parts. You know, I always get that one backwards for some reason, which really is not a good sign, but just to give you a sense of scale of this waterfront project, I'm sure many of you know of Battery Park City in New York. These are balloons that roughly graphically represent the relative scale. Canary Wharf in London and the waterfront area in Toronto. We have about 2,000 acres of land that have been put in the designated waterfront area, of which we are supposed to be the heads of revitalization. And you can't really master plan 2,000 acres all at one time, and some of this land is occupied, but much of it is vacant. There's a post-industrial waterfront that occupies a big chunk of this area, and that's what we really have focused our attention on, and that's what I'll be showing you mostly tonight. There's a lot of challenges in doing this project, and I will start with the past mistakes. There's a long history of false starts on the waterfront that have created a lot of public cynicism that we've had to overcome, a lot of sense that bad things were done, money was misspent, and interestingly enough, that the built form of what got developed was wrong. There was what was called the wall of condos that was built in the 1980s, and in reaction to that, the governments decided they needed to form a development corporation that could keep the public interest as much in mind as the financial. The infrastructure is not very good. A lot of this is brownfield land that is contaminated and needs remediation. The city itself hasn't done a great job of taking care of its infrastructure for the past few decades. Planning in Toronto and approvals is extremely complex, as it is in any large city, but it's a Byzantine system fraught with a lot of politics, and fraught with systems that don't actually come to logical conclusions very often. So you find yourself chasing your tail, which spends quite a lot of time and energy and requires more work than one should probably have to put into the plans. Once you've produced them, you spend more time refining them than you do actually developing them in the first place. Our corporation has very limited power. We do not have the ability to raise any money independently. We also do not own any of the land that we are the developers for, which is a huge challenge. And we have no real ability to override government. We have no statutory authority for planning. So everything we do, we have to take through the traditional approval bodies, which means even if you want to do something bold and innovative, you've still got to go through all the same city folks who review every application for every building and every project that's being done in the city. Political divisiveness, because we have 3 levels of government, they often don't agree on any one given agenda. And because we have to answer to all 3 of them, there's a lot of negotiation that has to go on just to get consensus on a project before we can get the funding. And then even once we've gotten the funding, the implementation is often fraught with political division as well. So it's not a simple context. I wish that I worked for a company that owned all the land and circumvented all of the local land use regulations, but I don't. And so as a result, you have to learn to work around that. Nonetheless, we have a very strong mandate. So we are supposed to create waterfront access for everyone, make the whole waterfront accessible. We're supposed to use a strong public engagement process for transparent and open planning. The mandate is for quality of place and good city building. From my point of view, thankfully, design excellence is actually in there in our sort of founding legislation, as is sustainable growth and the idea that we're doing this to make make Toronto globally competitive with other cities in Canada and around the world. The city also passed an official plan, and these types of documents you will find in your life as a planner are very important because they prescribe what you can and cannot do. The one for the city was created shortly before the Waterfront Corporation was founded, so about 10 years ago. And it has 4 guiding principles that we have relied on for our work. And they sound very simple: removing barriers, creating a network of spectacular parks, promoting a clean, green environment, and fostering new neighborhoods and growth. But what you find in reality is that there's quite a lot of room for interpretation as to what those things mean. And actually delivering them is a lot harder than it sounds when you start off. So with this framework, we have boldly gone forth and taken on this waterfront. So what you see here in the green is the extent of the area that we are primarily responsible for. So if any of you have heard of our little downtown airport, our island airport controversy, that's our airport. That's kind of the western edge of our site. And then this is what we call our central waterfront. Then we get to the eastern end, where we have our East Bayfront, and I'll show you these labels in a moment. The West Donlands, this is the Don River, which is one of the 2 rivers that kind of bracket the city of Toronto. And this is a chunk of our industrial Portlands area. And unfortunately, this slide is very hard to read, and I was not able to get one that was more legible, so I've just described the names for you. I'm going to start off just by showing you some of what we've completed very quickly, and then I'll get into kind of how we have gone about doing the planning. So this is Sugar Beach, which is a project where we took a contaminated parking lot and turned it into an anchor for new development. Sherburne Common, another park space that was turned into a park with a sustainability stormwater treatment facility built into it. Underpass Park, this was a off-ramp from one of the highways, which we transformed into a park that stitches 2 sides of a neighborhood together. I lost my existing conditions photo here of Corktown Common, but this is a park that's built on top of a new flood protection landform, a huge berm that protects the Don River from being able to flood the rest of the downtown, and atop that we built this park. We also worked on a series of wave decks. You can see this nasty condition that we had at all of the slips in downtown. They came right up to the roadway, the main roadway, Queens Quay. We had about a 4-foot wide sidewalk, a nice highway guardrail to create pedestrian comfort. and then a little grassy slope which everyone used to ride their bikes on because the sidewalk was too narrow to even walk on. And so we created these wave decks, which were designed for us by West 8. And that was the one at Spadina. Here's the one at Simcoe. And, you know, what was behind all of these was, again, a kind of opportunistic interpretation of what people said they wanted. There was a small amount of money set aside to improve these pinch point conditions, and an assumption that we might cantilever out some concrete, widen the sidewalk a little bit. And seeing that funding there, it seemed to make a lot of sense to say, well, let's try and get some more design involved. Let's see if there's a way to think beyond the functional problem and really deal with the idea of urbanism and creating a landscape out of these spaces. That secondary plan that I talked about, the city's official plan, called for creating spectacular places here. And this gets back to where I said that people have very different interpretations of what that means. I think for many people that meant, well, a nice wide concrete pad with a few planters on it would be a really great thing to have at the foot of the street. And other people said could be a lot more than that. And I think what we finally got was quite a bit more than that. We've also had a few buildings developed now on these former industrial sites. This is the George Brown College Health Sciences building designed by Bruce Kuwabara, who'll be speaking after me. The Chorus Entertainment headquarters, this is a big TV production company that consolidated about 6 different offices on the waterfront. This is a condominium project, actually designed by Saucier and Perrot, who are Montreal architects. It's a striking building, very different from any of the residential that's going up in the city right now. This is a public housing project that's right across the street from the other one. And one of our sites in the West Don Lands was selected as the location for the Athletes Village for the Pan Am Games. This particular building actually also happened to be designed by Bruce Kuwabara. So I'm going to talk now about how we have tried to negotiate that territory between planning and design, which has been, I think, the mission for this waterfront because of the aspirations of design excellence and quality of place. And we have really not followed a kind of traditional sequential process of saying, bring in the planners, identify what all the constraints are, come up with a list of what you can't do, and then a smaller subset of what you can do, and wrap a few constraints around that, and then hand it off to the architects to do what they can with it. And if I sound a little cynical, it's only because I worked as a planner for many years before getting a design education. And it was actually my own belief that planners too often make decisions that are in fact design decisions, and they don't think of them as design decisions. And engineers are 10 times more guilty of that than planners are, but they both do the same thing where they'll tell you, well, this is the sort of functional solution. I haven't designed anything, when in fact they've wrapped huge numbers of parameters around it. So my desire to go to architecture school was really to see if you could bring these two professions into closer alignment and get them to work together. And it's not always easy, but I think the results are really worth it. This is a precinct, one of the first precincts we've worked on in the waterfront. It's called the West Don Lands. This is a big chunk of provincially owned land as it appeared about 10 years ago. And this is an example of government looking for, I would say, sort of quick and relatively simple solutions. The province was really hoping to find some sort of a public-private partnership deal where they could dispose of this whole chunk of land wholesale to a large company. And they wanted to sell it off for a racetrack. They wanted to sell it off for some sort of a entertainment complex. They did not want to have to engage in all of the difficult planning work. And in reaction to those proposals, actually, a strong community group was formed called the West Don Lands Committee, whose purpose in life was to try and get something else to happen on these lands. So after the province tried for 20 years, they kind of gave up, and the land was turned over to us to go through a planning process. And we engaged Ray Gindros, Urban Design Associates from Pittsburgh, actually to do the master plan. And Ray's idea was really to try to find ways to reintroduce the kind of street grid that defined all the neighborhoods around this area and link it back in And I won't go into all the details, but it was quite a clever plan. And it also had to accommodate this huge landform that I told you about. So where you see this, the big green blob, this is all an earthwork structure that holds back the river. And it is widened here because it has to then join into another structure, which is the rail berm to hold back the river. And so Ray's plan was really to say, let's create that berm and let's just accept that it's there. We can't build much on it. Let's make a park out of it and try and define the neighborhood around it. Now, it's got a kind of neoclassical look to it, which I think troubled a lot of architects when they looked at it, but it was not ever really intended to define an architectural style. And the Saussure and Perrette building that I showed you is actually being built in this neighborhood in conformity with the precinct plan as it was developed. So a set of design guidelines were put together, but it was really about a block size and setting a framework and setting a public realm framework, which we then took and developed. And we did an entire public realm framework plan in conjunction with that master plan that looked at all of the streets, how those streets were going to be designed, and it was one of our early beginnings of bringing landscape architects in to define the city, because we hired an actual landscape architecture firm, Phillips Farvag Smallenberg from Vancouver, to design all of the streets. And I can still remember way back talking to my boss, who's an enlightened person and a city builder, and having to explain to him why we needed to hire landscape architects to do the streetscape. Didn't we already have the precinct plan? And I said, well, John, I don't really know that that's a landscape. I mean, it kind of tells me there's supposed to be some trees and some green, but I don't really see a compelling urban cityscape there. Not that this picture is necessarily that either. This is just a rendering, but the point is we went from a lot of orange boxes with a few green circles to a lot more green stuff, but we actually got there through a design process. So I convinced everyone we should hire a landscape firm and have them take the lead in designing the streets, which also meant having the civil engineers work underneath the landscape architects. Something that many in the landscape architecture profession always bemoan is that they don't control the civil engineers. One of the things I discovered is they don't control them because they don't know how to control them, and that's another issue. But I think if Harvard wants to contribute something to the landscape profession, teaching them how to work with civil engineers and actually manage them would be good, because I put a lot of trust in some landscape architects and then spent many years suffering the consequences of people saying, you know, these guys are not managing the civil engineers at all. This is all not working out. And it was a very uneasy process, and not one that anyone was that familiar with, to be honest. And you would be amazed at the arguments you can have about trees and whether or not a tree should be somewhere. And you would do a streetscape plan and say, here's our colonnade of trees, and then the engineers would come along and say, that's where the sewer pipe has to go. And then you would talk to people at the city or talk to other people within the organization, and they would say, well, what's the big deal? So you have to lose a couple of the trees. And you'd say, well, the whole idea was to create a continuous alley. And, you know, people really had a hard time wrapping their minds around that. And we had arguments in this precinct, too, about where the trees were as some of the individual buildings came online. The architects wanted to put the doorways in a certain spot, and the very first thing they did was push the trees away on the streetscape from the front of their building and said, well, that's where I'm putting the front door, and you've got trees there. I don't want trees in front of the front door. And I said, so put your front door somewhere else, because we've already designed the streetscape, and the trees are here. And if you move those trees, I'm going to lose the continuity of this streetscape. And the look of shock and awe was really quite something. But everybody expects that from me now, I think, in Toronto. So people don't try and move trees so easily around. This is that same image again with this sort of promotional marketing piece that was put together just to show the different projects that are underway. And I just want to give you a sense of the scale of this. So this is that same site after having been cleared and prepped about 3 years ago, I think. So in the foreground, you can see the beginnings of the park, Corktown Common Park, which was designed by Michael van Valkenburg. You can see the beginnings of that street grid, which is being laid out as per the designs of Phillips Farvag Smallenberg, and some historic buildings that had to be retained. And then this is, about a year ago, pretty much that same view looking at the park. So the park is largely finished. The whole side of it that is on what they call the dry side of the berm, because the berm goes up from the riverbank and then comes back down. The wet side can't have anything on it other than grass. The dry side can be a park. And we packed, or Michael packed, a lot of interest and spatial complexity, I would say, into these 8 acres. There's another 8 acres of meadow that will follow. But it's a very beguiling park. It's very Olmstedian, obviously, in its approach, but we don't really have a lot of Olmstedian parks. We really don't have a park design tradition in Toronto at all, I would say. It's basically evolved through the acquisition of, and for the most part, former quarries that were leveled and grass was thrown down and trees were allowed to grow. And that's kind of the landscape tradition as far as parks go in Toronto. There's no Frederick Law Olmsted or anyone like that you can find back in the history. This is a marsh that was recreated. This site used to be marshland. It was where the Don River ran through. And Michael wanted to recreate some sort of gesture of a marsh. And what's really fantastic about this is not only how quickly it has grown in and how it has attracted frogs and dragonflies and all those other things, but it is right across the street from that. So it's really created a very interesting dichotomy between the intense urbanism, which was the desire of the precinct plan, and this built form, this very kind of tall base built form, and then a park across the street that talks about a lot of the sustainability values and issues that we are concerned about. And all the runoff from that entire park is collected and used to feed that marsh. One of the other great things about this project is because this plan was approved when the province decided to bid for the 2015 Pan Am Games, which are kind of the America's version of the Olympics. They chose this site, and the main reason they chose it was because it was already planned and approved. One of the biggest challenges when these types of games are held in building these athletes' villages for housing 8,000 people is it's very hard to get something of that size through an approval process in time. You have 7 years basically from when you win the bid until you have to build the thing. So they selected this site because it was ready to go and they knew there would not be much political opposition. But again, the province really wanted to subvert the principles of the precinct plan. They wanted more towers, more density. And because we had worked with the community so consistently on this process, the community actually came out to the meetings and said, you can't do that. We want this plan built the way it was approved by City Council. And basically we have built this out almost exactly according to the terms of the precinct plan. And when it's done, I think it'll be the first sort of real complete statement of what it is we've been trying to achieve from a city building point of view. The second site is right on the main waterfront in the downtown, the east downtown. We call it the East Bayfront. And the master plan for this was actually done by Fred Coder and Susie Kim, who are here tonight. They were hired by Waterfront Toronto, again, to try and do a plan that was not just about redevelopment, but city building. This land was owned by the city's Economic Development Corporation. They too wanted to kind of farm it out wholesale to a giant developer, give them the land, let them do with it as they would. And our goal was really to say, no, we want to start with an idea about public space, how buildings define public space, and create what's more of a community. So in this case, we had very interesting local political conflict between Fred and a local architect in town who had a very different idea about how to do this. And his idea was that the waterfront was a harsh environment, and his main architectural idea was to build a wall of buildings straight across there, all the way across, right across the slips and everything, and then within them to carve out little parks that would be sheltered. And Fred's conception was we should really be manipulating the built form to open up the view corridors from the north. This is our elevated highway that runs through the downtown, and this is our main rail corridor, and all the rest of the city is up here. So everyone has to come down through these tiny little compressed points to get to the waterfront. And Fred's idea was let's create that release as soon as you get through, rather than continuing the sense of compression and hiding the water until you'd actually made it right out to the water's edge. And We, again, had worked very long and hard with the community on this project. They had shaped a lot of the built form. They worked very iteratively with Fred and his team on this and felt a real sense of ownership of this plan and rallied around Waterfront Toronto again to protect the plan from being upended. The politics were extra complicated because the architect with the other proposal was good friends of the mayor at the time, and the mayor at the time really wanted to do what his friend was suggesting that he do, and that created a lot of friction and tension, and then that played itself out again in a building that was right down here, and maybe I'll let Bruce talk about that later. I don't know if he's planning to or not, but this idea was to create this view corridor opening and provide a kind of public gathering space here. And after this plan was approved, that same architect was brought on board to do this building, and the first thing he wanted to do was get rid of this diagonal and build it right up against the water's edge, trying to use some of our own language in a way against us to say, well, you've said you want to have built form define the edges of things, so you know this big space you've got there is very loose and not very well defined, and it spills out onto this edge, and why do you need that? And we got into quite a little bit of a battle over that as well. We did eventually decide to push this whole building over and bring this street through, straight through, and create a new park here, which is one of the ones I showed you already, Sugar Beach. But there again, the design for Sugar Beach was actually done through a design competition, a very participatory one, which I'll describe in more detail in a couple minutes. And we had a lot of staunch support for that as well. So again, a rendering of this plan with the green. That's Sugar Beach, that's the park, photographed from the roof of that building that would have been built right to about there, had the other plan gone forward. In the center is the Sherburne Common. I showed you that before. This park is a integral component of our stormwater treatment system. So all of the stormwater from the neighborhood and from the buildings that will be built here will get collected, go into a settlement tank, and then it is pumped into the basement of the pavilion that's in this park, which has a huge UV treatment facility, and then that water is pumped through these public art sculptures where it gets aerated, goes into our biofiltering wetlands, and comes out clean enough to be a public water feature, which is actually a very difficult thing to do with rainwater. Getting it to the point where public health officials will let people touch it, believe it or not, is very difficult. And we had a lot of lengthy debates with them about this because they said we couldn't do it, and we said, well, what's the standard you want it clean to? And they said, well, we don't have a standard. We don't know what the standard ought to be. So we, in fact, had to help them create a regulation by which they could then judge this project, and which hopefully they will use on other projects as other people try to do these innovative things. So there's a huge amount of stick to it that's necessary if you want to do innovative work on this scale, because you run up against these sorts of obstacles all the time, and unless you're willing to basically do the other guy's work for them, you can't really get these things through. So we had this beautiful park designed, and it wasn't until we were into construction documents that the water department or the Department of Health said, hey, wait a minute, you can't do that. And that was after 2 years of design and consultation and review with all the city agencies. So it's as I said, it's a kind of cycle that doesn't seem to have a beginning or an end. People in government can kind of jump on at any point and assert themselves, and you've got to deal with it. This is the that same water feature becomes frozen in the winter and is a skating rink. We also have, I would say, up the design bar a bit with the development community because of our emphasis on design excellence and because of the presence of our design panel that Bruce will talk about. But we've got a lot of developers in Toronto who don't generally hire top-end architects now coming forward with proposals by well-known architects. This is a design for a building right next to the park I just showed you. This is the sculptural arm with the water, designed by Moshe Safdie. This has gone through our design panel. And this is another building that's just immediately south of that, also along that same east side of the park, but at the water's edge by a different development firm, by Hines, but they've got Architectonica as their architect. And whether or not you love the designs of the buildings, these are not developers who would necessarily have come along with architects of this reputation and caliber before, but we're at a point where they now know they kind of have to, or they will have a much more difficult time getting selected. And all of the land that we sell is public land that we dispose of through a competitive process. And if you don't provide evidence that you're going to do good design as well as do a good development and pay us money for the land, you don't win. So that was precinct planning is one of the main vehicles that we used on the waterfront. But another one that I think gets at this idea of blending design and planning even better is the design competitions that we've run. So I would say the first one, and in some ways maybe the most significant one, is the one for the central waterfront. And the goal here was really to look at all these pieces that we were working on, some of which were built at the time, some weren't, and nothing really hung together. And we wanted to make a way to sort of stitch the few good elements we had with the new elements that were coming along into one thing. And I mentioned the wave decks before. We had, I think, $20 million budget for building those widened platforms at the ends of the slips. And that had to get leveraged into this big design competition because there was no way people would give money for anything beyond that in the absence of an idea about it. So the design competition was cleverly structured around the idea of coming up with designs for these points at the heads of the slips, but also the terms of reference required looking at the whole, finding a way to stitch those independent pieces together, trying to look at Queens Quay, which is our main east-west boulevard. And we ran this competition in a very unusual way. The idea was first kind of not supported by the city because, again, we hadn't done all of the kind of planning background work. But we had a pretty fair idea of how the street worked and how it didn't work. And we engaged the community, in fact, in writing the competition brief. So we set to write the assignment. I drafted it. I actually shared it with one of our community representation groups. They commented on it. I shared it with all the technical staff at the city, which was a difficult process because it wasn't really consistent with how they like to see things done. But we got their approval to issue this, and we got 5 fantastic responses or 5 fantastic designs out of it. And this is the winning one that was by West 8 and Du Toit Alsop Hillier, which is their local partner. And really the key to this was the idea of transforming our main street into something better. And you can look at this photo. That's our main waterfront street in Toronto. And it's not a particularly lovely image. And in fact, this photograph appeared in an article by a Canadian planner who said that Queens Quay was the 2nd ugliest street in North America. And so, you know, things like that actually help make the case for convincing people we should do a design competition for the street. And we ran the competition, and all through the competition we had participation as well. So there was a kickoff day for the 5 teams. It was a mandatory thing they had to come to. And one of the features of it was they got a walking tour from the community representatives. So they actually walked the whole length of the study area with residents who would say things from, you know, I want something grand and fantastic here, to please don't move that bench. I like sitting there when I buy my coffee in the morning. But those are the kinds of inputs that you need to think about and filter and somehow accommodate. And there's a very sophisticated group of community activists in Toronto, and I think they had a very good sense of the aspirations that they wanted, and they were able to convey that. So the teams went off, and then halfway through they had a mid-review. So all the teams came back to Toronto, and they actually had to get a crit from the community groups halfway through the process. And it was actually a very intelligent discourse, a lot of interesting thoughts. We also gave them a crit with the city technical staff, which was maybe a little bit more painful for them, but to basically make sure they were at least heading in a generally good direction. And then at the end of that process, we actually unveiled the designs and had them presented in a public forum at BCE Place, which is a big galleria designed by Santiago Calatrava, actually, in Toronto. And we had about 500 people show up to hear the unveiling of the results of a design competition, which is a pretty large number of folks. And there was a lot of enthusiastic support for the design that won. So just to show you some of the imagery of the design, I'm not going to go into all the details, but this is another view of that street as it looked just a few years ago. And this is a rendering overlaid on that of the design for a red and white granite mosaic pattern, a double alley of trees, a new granite sidewalk on the north side of the street, and an upgraded TTC. The design was even more ambitious than this when it came out of the competition, but we've gone through many rounds of value engineering and technical constraints. And what's really important, though, is I think we have preserved the essence of what's great about this design while making a lot of compromises along the way to get it approved. So this had to be approved by every single person in the city who approves anything having to do with streets and roads and transportation, and our TTC, which is our Transit Commission, who operate the streetcar here. We spent 2 years doing the environmental assessment. 1 year was getting the public through it because we were taking away 2 lanes of traffic. The south side used to be 2 travel lanes and is converted into a public esplanade and a dedicated bike trail. And the north side becomes a 2-way street. What's now 2 lanes going one direction becomes 2-way. And that's a big thing for people to wrap their minds around, that you can reduce car capacity. And we're going through that with our expressway right now in a much bigger way. So after we'd convinced all of the transportation planners that we could in fact make this work, and we'd convinced the community that they'd still be able to get into their driveways, and we spent, I don't even know how many meetings I had with property owners late at night, designing every inch of these curbs for everyone. So we had to meet with the Canadian Institute for the Blind and design this curb and design this whole crossing system because it's atypical. You cross a road, then you cross a streetcar, then a bike track. There's nothing else like it in Toronto, and they did not know how to deal with that either. But you have to immerse yourself in these details for the project to turn out all right. The project's now under construction. I'm still worried that the details aren't going to turn out all right, and I think that the details are going to be what make or break this project. But you've got to be out there fighting for them. This is after the Simcoe wave deck was built as our sort of initial phase, but this is what the street looked like. And this, again, is the vision for what it will be. So it's all the traffic's consolidated on this side, bike trail, wide esplanade. Toronto does not have wide sidewalks. This will be probably one of the widest in the city at 7 meters. And will certainly feel spacious compared to what you experience. All of these trees are planted in soil cells because we have a real problem with street trees in the city of Toronto. The average life is about 7 years for a street tree, which is very sad for a country like Canada that grows big trees that live a long time. And that was another huge hurdle of approvals with the city. But once you've got a design concept like this that you've got support behind, those folks at the city start to realize, gee, I actually have to try and figure out how to make this happen, or I'm going to run afoul of those people. And the idea, in fact, captivated people so much that we managed to get another $80 million allocated to this project above the 20 that we had for the wave decks. And that was solely because of the quality of the idea, how excited people were about it, and how much it rallied people behind it. So creating a constituency for these things, you cannot underestimate how important that is. You can do a great plan that you think is a great plan that makes a lot of sense, but if it doesn't capture the imagination of a constituency who will then stick up for it and support it, it's not going to go anywhere. And I think that's where design and planning really have to work together, because I really have yet to see in my professional career a planning diagram that got me really excited and passionate. I've seen ones that are interesting, and I get what they mean, and I think they're meaningful and important, but you can't really bring those to the public and get people too excited about them. You really need an idea about design, and design is also a great problem-solving tool, and I think it has tended to not be considered one in the planning profession. The planners think they have to solve all the problems, and then designers come in and overlay. And I think the engineers, civil engineers, approach it that way too. And I think what we've discovered through doing this, and I've heard architects say this, is, this is so great. We're actually being treated as problem solvers, not just as estheticians on these projects. And that really is, I think, eye-opening for everyone, because no one really expected this idea for the street. And I can tell you no planner would have very likely come up with it, because the traffic studies and other things were challenging, and it took us 2 years to work it through and actually make it work out. And if you were doing it at first blush, you would say, it's a crazy idea. It's not gonna fly. But when you had an image behind it that got people motivated, it created the motivation to find the solutions to the problem. But it's a lot of years of struggling through it. And then this is just a sign of how much this project has now been embraced. This is the north side of the street. This is, these are all basically privately owned sidewalks. The city only owns a little strip that's about 1 meter wide from the curb to here. And this is all set back on private land where we don't have the ability to go in and simply do what we want to do. So it seemed to me very important that we not just put a little red strip of granite here and that we find a way to get the whole sidewalk to be taken care of. So I worked with our board of directors to convince them that the easiest way to make this happen would be if we shared the cost of the granite with the private landowners. So it's always a little bit tricky giving public money to private landowners. But the case we made is that this is all public access easement that has to be maintained for the public as per the development agreements all these condos had with the city. So we were in effect improving a public asset. And we were able to convince our board to do that and allocate about $1 million for this cost sharing program. And I then went around to every single one of these condo boards. There's about 18 different condominium corporations that each have hundreds of members, and pitched this idea and really convinced them by showing them that. So that's that same view with the red granite and the difference that it would make, the way it would tie their buildings into the public realm. And much to my amazement, actually, there was a huge amount of support and enthusiasm for this. And we have signed up all 16 of these condo buildings, all of whom are paying hundreds of thousands of dollars towards this granite program. And we will have this continuous intact fabric all along the north side. And this is it now in construction. So what year is it? 2014? So 8 years later. 8 years after the design competition, we're finally underway building it and having the coldest damn winter in Toronto's history, so it's moving things a bit slowly, but it is happening, and you know, the project has, in a way, created its own momentum, and that's been so key to getting it to happen. The second design competition that we worked on was in many ways much more complex and tried to deal with a whole series of issues that arise around this coming together of the Don River, and it then flows into a concrete channel called the Keating Channel, and then spills out into the harbor. This is flood prone, and I showed you that park, Corktown Common, which was part of the flood protection system. That's it right there. But all of this needs to be, that flood protected this part of the city, but all of this was still in the floodplain. And the Conservation Authority was busily working away on a plan to not only flood protect, but to naturalize at the same time, so to try to take the river out of the concrete channel and make a landscape out of it. And they were all set to kind of wiggle it in between the railroad tracks and the elevated Gardner Expressway and underneath it, because most of the enlightened planners in town, when this project first came up, said, well, no one's going to want to live near that thing. So, and that land's kind of useless, so run it through there. And that was the assumption they were working on. At the same time, we were trying to extend our street grid out and connect this part of the city up. And there were about half a dozen other major studies going on for how to get transportation out into this area, and none of them were talking to each other. So we were planning transportation, streetcar routes that weren't looking at where we were planning the roads weren't looking at where the river was going to go, and I more or less convinced everyone that we should do a design competition to bring all these things together. And that was a heavy lift because the flood protection piece was seen as very hydrologically driven and very scientific, and not something that, you know, designers could handle in a design competition environment. So we required multidisciplinary teams to bid on this. So you had to have a hydrologist on your team, you had to have a civil engineer on your team, landscape architect, urban designer, and the idea was to look at the problem holistically and say, if you're trying to flood protect and naturalize this river, how can you make an asset out of it? It was clear from the beginning it was going to cost at least $200 or $300 million to do it. You could spend $200 or $300 million to hide it between a highway and a rail berm and get absolutely nothing out of it, other than having completed the project itself, or my hope was that there would be a way you could really leverage it for better city building. And so this is the winning scheme that came in. Teams were allowed to be led by architects, landscape architects, planners. This team was led by Michael van Valkenburg with Ken Greenberg as the planner. And it was a very simple but very brilliant idea that no one had ever thought of. Everyone had always looked at the channel and either thought, well, we've got to rip out the concrete and naturalize it in place, and that's tricky, or we can put it up here where everyone thought we should put it through what is the most contaminated land on the waterfront. And the MVVA team said, well, actually, this land's all vacant. Why don't we just move the river mouth and create enough space for it to have the naturalization occur on either side, and then build a park system adjacent to it, and then use the river as the centerpiece for development on either side. And again, this project had a huge amount of public support. People who had been championing the naturalization of this river for years and years were very thrilled. And this is what that land looked like today. Now, we haven't quite started construction on this because we also ran into a political impasse with our current mayor, who had a very different idea for this land and wanted to build a shopping mall and a Ferris wheel, which was all very famously talked about in the media in Toronto. It's the same mayor who smokes crack, by the way. So, you know, who knows where that idea really came from, but it was taken very seriously, and there was a legislative effort launched by them to actually take planning control for this site away from us and give it to an agency headed by one of the mayor's high school buddies. And again, because we had worked with the community on this process and taken them through that exact same multi-staged involvement where the community, I still remember doing the site walk on a freezing cold snowy day with the community members walking through this industrial wasteland and doing mid-reviews with the community again, and in this case, a community of people not like the Queen's Quay project who just happened to live there, but these were activists who'd been working on naturalizing this river for 30 years, since the 70s. And some of these guys were very, very passionate and vocal, and very skeptical at first when this was being started, that this was somehow an underhanded plot to take away all that they had accomplished in creating this political momentum for naturalization. They're very suspicious that we were not legitimate about it. But I've had some of those members now say to me, wow, I was completely wrong, and this is 10 times better than anything that would ever have come out of the traditional planning process that we were working through. And one of them, who is a known threatener of lawsuits and other things, came up to me and said, I don't need to worry about this project anymore. It's done. You've put it in place. Well, that was before the mayor came along with the Ferris wheel. And so we spent a year having to review this project and reconsider it, more or less in contrast to the Ferris wheel idea. And because the basics were so fundamentally sound, this was actually the cheapest way to do it, because if you tried to renaturalize it in place, you had to reroute the river temporarily anyway, because water has to go somewhere. And you actually had to build more of the infrastructure up front than you do just running it through this vacant land. So it was cheaper. It worked the best from a hydrological perspective, and created really the best sort of green space. So it turned out, with very minor modification, I would say, kind of the way it started. Again, I think the design intent was preserved. This is the modification. So it doesn't quite widen out the way it used to. The city wanted more density on their publicly owned land here. Private landowners here didn't want so much naturalization on their edge. And the Port Authority didn't want our park being extended out into the navigable waters of our harbor, which is hardly used at all for shipping. But they were adamant that that was not something they could possibly give up. And that was something that we had to take seriously, because this was a formal environmental assessment process. It was going to the Ministry of the Environment for approval, and they, as a interested party, could have tanked the whole project. So we had to make this decision to lop that off, and we spent a lot of time agonizing about that, and I got Michael van Valkenburg's office to think about, could we still make a decent enough park here that we could stand tall on, and after they did some work, they felt they could. So we struck the right compromises to get the approval, but I think we kept to the design integrity. So this is just some renderings of what this new river will look like when it gets built. And the area around the Keating Channel, which is the current waterway, will become intensely urbanized. So we've satisfied the naturalists who want a natural river, and we've satisfied the desire to create some higher density development. Here's that park, promontory park that was lopped off to keep this dock wall so that we can dock ships there. And the integrated parkland. So had the Conservation Authority had their way, there would have been no city parkland adjacent to this. They really want their marshland to just be theirs. They don't want people walking in it, and they don't want jurisdictional complications with the Parks Department. And we would have been pushed, I think, into a kind of hands off the marsh area, build the little postage stamp parks throughout the neighborhood. And this, I think, is a much better answer, because not only do you get, I think, a better park in and of itself, but having it adjacent to the marshland and the river, it all just creates that much more room and continuity in the public realm. So last one, and then I'll turn it over to Bruce. This is also an environmental assessment. And again, I'm using Canadian language, and you probably know of EISs is how they tend to be called in the United States, Environmental Impact Study. And they're very cumbersome, involved, long processes. They tend to be very engineering-led, though planners get very involved in them. The most famous one in the US actually involved the Westway proposal in New York City to put the West Side Highway into a tunnel under the Hudson River. It involved extensive landfill. They were going to create dozens of acres of new parkland, create new development sites. And the community did not like this idea and pushed back. And it was through the vehicle of the environmental assessment that the project was finally killed. They were found to have not having done their environmental assessment accurately. And in its place, we got the at-grade boulevard, 8-lane at-grade boulevard, that is the West Side Highway today. So here we are facing a very similar challenge. We've got a deteriorated elevated highway that runs right through downtown. We have a very divided public about what to do with it. We've got people who very passionately equate driving on a highway with freedom, and I've been told that directly to my face. You're taking away my freedom if you take away the elevated highway. And then we have people who think at-grade boulevards are wonderful things, and it'll be just like Europe. And so we had a very polarized debate, and no one really had any idea what any of these things were going to look like. So we did another design competition, and in this case, there was not really destined to be a winner, per se. We didn't have a specific project that we could hand off, and no one was convinced that you could really come up with the right answer to this problem simply through a design competition. And I think that was probably true, but I think what it did do is it gave everybody tools to talk about the different options and how might it look if we keep it up, how might it look if we take it down. And we got some very good response on this. Again, Bruce's firm submitted an idea for retaining the highway. I think Bruce and his colleagues are very aware of the very difficult politics of trying to get rid of it, proposed building a whole new grade level up above the level of the highway, so you could actually have park space with a great prospect out onto the river and onto the lake, and the highway kind of below it, a little bit like the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway in Brooklyn Heights, for those of you who are familiar with that. Diller and Scofidio teamed with a local firm. They also wanted to retain it and proposed, I think, a very ingenious but probably not very affordable idea for cladding the underside with Ipe wood, which would be beautiful but would never get past the highway inspectors, and then creating these very fanciful spaces which I don't know how rentable they would be and how much it would cost to build them and if you could ever recover your costs, but it would certainly create a very interesting environment underneath. It did require moving the local road out from under the highway, which was another challenge spatially. West 8 actually came up with, this is again where a design competition can sometimes produce solutions that no one else would have thought of. Their idea was that on our main rail corridor, it's this wide embankment, and only about half of it has tracks on it. The other half is just kind of storage yards and a couple of little maintenance sheds. And they said, well, how about we keep the highway, but instead of building it next to the rail yard, we just put it right up on top of that embankment and build it right next to the tracks. And that idea got a lot of traction with the traffic engineers, because what that would enable you to do is build a whole new highway while keeping the old one in operation, which no other scheme really enables you to do. Well, traffic disruption during construction is a huge issue, and a lot of cities are now being forced to actually calculate the lost productivity value of it. And it's huge amounts of money when you look at people sitting in their cars for 3 hours because traffic's delayed by construction. And that became a huge point of discussion and still is a huge point of discussion in Toronto. How much is this going to cost people? How much is the delay going to cost people? And so this one had no construction delay cost, whether you believe in that metric or not. It did not trigger that. And really the highest levels of city government really wanted this to happen. And again, this came right out of the competition. No one had ever talked about doing it this way before. We then got a tunnel alternative from Gordon Gill, Adrian Smith. This is the kind of Boston Big Dig approach, but this stretch is only 2.5 kilometers long, and the ramps to get up and down to it would have been about 3/4 of a kilometer on either end. So while you would have created a nice continuity for 2.5 kilometers, you would have had 1.5 kilometers of no continuity. But people are wedded to this. There are people who think this is the right thing to do. The big difference in our city is that unlike 93, which is primarily a through route, and has always been used primarily as a through route, our elevated expressway here is 80% used just to get to downtown. Very few of the cars using it are through cars. So the need for the tunnel is a lot less clear in Toronto. Interestingly enough, Office for Metropolitan Architecture submitted a plan for this, which everyone thought was a little over the top because it had some very mega structures proposed. It wanted to realign our Lakeshore Boulevard up through this vacant industrial site and get rid of the highway, but bring all of the transit, bring the highway, the local roads into a mega structure that he called a transferium. It was a 9,000 car parking garage with a 5-level shopping mall on top of that. Intermodal exchanges with the streetcar would be routed to go through this building. Our regional transit line was going to go through the building. And it was this huge thing kind of sitting on a big grassy plain because he was aware of this naturalization and said, well, I'll just bring the naturalization all the way over here. We'll naturalize the whole site. This thing will just sit up on big columns and all the transportation infrastructure will fly in up above. So there was a lot of, I think, giggling about this project. But what's ironic is that basically this is now happening. Not because of Rem Koolhaas, but this site only about a year later was bought by a commercial developer who wants to create an intermodal transportation hub here. He's proposing highway off-ramps to come right into his site. He wants a commuter train stop to be added here. He wants the streetcar diverted to go through his site. And he wants to do a very concentrated development right where this circle is, and then smaller buildings going outward from it. So in a way, I would say Rem Koolhaas kind of had a crystal ball on this one, and an idea that seemed very far-fetched in the design competition. Actually, maybe the aesthetics were a little over the top in terms of the scale and monumentality, but his underlying planning idea was very much what people are trying to do now. And then the last scheme, which there is no really great single drawing of, is the at-grade boulevard, and this was proposed by James Corner, which was very gratifying to me because I'm sure most of you know Jim Corner worked on the High Line, and when we set out to do this design exercise, everyone said, the Gardner should be the next High Line. We should just turn the highway into an elevated park like they did in New York. And when James came on, I asked him what he thought, and he said, I think it's a terrible idea to do that with the Gardner. It has nothing in common with the High Line. The High Line had a successional landscape on it that was spectacular and created a climate for that. It had a very different relationship to the buildings around it, a very different relationship to grade, and a very different architectural quality. And he said, I would get rid of the thing here. I would not try to keep it, and I would not build a park out of it. So that became a very persuasive counter-argument to those who were lobbying, and some people still are lobbying, that we should get rid of it but not get rid of it. Get the cars off it but not take it down. I'm not really sure what that means deep down inside, why if you're not going to have cars on it, you still think there's value in keeping the structure up there. But all of this is very much in the midst of a huge environmental assessment process right now, the answer to which we haven't arrived at yet. So stay tuned, and we'll see if Toronto takes down its elevated expressway or keeps it up. So that's my piece of the presentation. I just want to introduce Bruce Kuwabara. He's already been introduced, but Bruce has in many ways been my partner in this because he chairs our design review panel, which was the first design review panel in Ontario. The city subsequently created one. And it's really his leadership in that and the fact that we've got kind of the A-team of the Toronto architecture community on this panel, that developers come with much better architects than they typically would, and that the bar's been raised so high on the public realm. And the panel has had, aside from that influence, a huge influence in actually shaping the outcomes of some of these projects. So, Bruce.
So this is kind of a very interesting moment in the history of the city, which is going through a growth spurt. You know, at one time there was an article that said that there were 150 construction cranes in Toronto, and that there's been an explosion of growth. It has to do with Canada's relatively open immigration policy, and also the fact that the provincial government froze the green belt, the agricultural green belt around Toronto, which drove and drives all of the growth into the city. And it's a kind of convergence of a number of economic and social factors that are driving the growth of Toronto as a creative city. And we have people like Richard Florida. We had a free agency trade where Bruce Mao went to Chicago, and we got Richard Florida and became a creative city. But I've loved every moment of it. It's been really the most exciting period of time where we were and are still involved in high-speed urbanism. And it's very, very complex, and it's very, very dynamic. And as I see the people in the room, some of the people here have actually had input to it. It's urbanisms, because there's so many different ideas that are moving. Chris has done an extraordinary job of holding it all together, and his ideas for the international competitions were really breakthroughs because they were not expected. And I remember getting a phone call from him asking me what I thought of his idea of having a design competition for the central waterfront. And I said, go for it. Just go for it. Because the mayor simply wanted to avoid collisions of pedestrians and hikers and people walking and cycling along the waterfront. There were a lot of complaints. And so out of that one little moment of political response, Chris somehow imagined that there was a different way to think about all of this. And the same for the mouth of the Lower Don. Those are the two big projects. And if you think about it, out of those projects, we got very large-scale thinking by very, very good landscape architects. It's been humbling, to tell you the truth, as an architect, because we realized that the things that are going to drive the urbanism are going to be much larger, and they're not just going to be streets and blocks. It's going to be major stormwater management systems, major thoroughfares along the waterfront, within which there will be buildings. And we have a lot of evidence now, because when we started, no one believed us. And it's been a long process. So I'm just going to talk about design review. I'm going to try, it's going to be a loop through things that Chris has talked about. But the goals of Waterfront Toronto are really about design excellence. And for us, that opens up everything from design competitions to creating opportunities for integrated design teams and younger designers, although we've been criticized for not having it enough. And this is just really interesting because for me, I'm trying to synthesize all my worlds. And I'm very fascinated in Paris, and a very different politics, very different vision. But I was at the Met, and I was looking at a great show, it's on now, photographs of Haussmann's Paris being constructed, the photographs of Merville, who is the official photographer for the creation of that urbanism. But I would show you that I love this because it shows that even in 19th century Paris, those developers were very greedy and wanted more. And so that when you walk through Paris, which is so continuous and so unified, you realize that it really isn't, that this was a very greedy developer who changed the profile, and then it exploded. It has to do with just reflecting on what the tools are, what the devices are to control form, and whether or not within the democracy we live in, which is very open and very dynamic, you can actually do it. And we can discuss that. These are just, it is about building typologies. These are the kind of photographs that are at the Met, which I thought were really interesting because it shows that you can actually make a physical change, that it can happen in a very short period of time. And then in North America, my experience with design review was in Denver, in the lower downtown district, which is industrial. We were actually competing, I think, with Fred Coder on this, but in the selection process. But our client owned this building, which is a heritage building, the Sugar Building. I.M. Pei designed the mall, the 16th Street Mall. And this site was for this new building, which is entirely mixed use, retail on the ground, 3 floors of office space, and then rental, residential. And I'd never been subjected to such rigorous requirements in terms of the building envelope. This is Denver's system that when you go to the first meeting, you can't show a rendering. You really have to argue for every part of your site. It's so didactic, it's so linear, but it's so difficult at the same time. I took those lessons and we tried to make a system that would deal with the forming of buildings, but within a systematic way so that people would come to design review and they would know what they're getting into. So this is our building, which for me is a real fabric building. It's about the mall, it's about the heritage building, it's about the residential, it's about an active ground floor, it's about scaling down into a minor street, and it's in a North American political planning and urban design context. Our city's growing. It's really growing very, very quickly. I've never imagined this city would look like this. And it makes you both really excited, but also there's a risk. We've never had a canvas as large as the one that Chris has outlined and shaped, where so many international designers have come, and there's so many visions for this waterfront, and how to keep it coherent, how to keep it continuous. Chris is the agent who really has been always stressing the continuity. Everyone comes in and they have a different idea. But he has one idea. So why design review? To protect the vision, to really try to enrich the quality of design, to make design really have value. And you wear many hats, and I think all of you will end up doing this. I think if you really want to step up, that you should move out of whatever you're doing, put on a different hat, and actually engage design process at an urban scale, because at that level, we are really building cities. We're really designing cities. What Waterfront Toronto did is they set about designing precincts, which the rest of the city isn't planned this way. This was an innovation, that you would actually think of whole chunks of the city as having a kind of structure. They hired, this is interesting to me, 2 American urban designers to lay out East Bayfront and West Don Lands, because I think that they had an ability and a capability to understand how to make a fabric on the waterfront that would have continuity with the rest of the city. Then they had the 2 landscape competitions which produced, so we have this influx, which has always been Toronto's history, the relationship between Europe and the United States. And I think that's always something that's been at work. And now, of course, it's totally global and totally open. We are always trying to keep score of what we've completed. This is hard to read, but we believe that more is coming, and as soon as West 8's Queens Quay transformation is finished, we will begin to hit a tipping point where we can begin to walk across the waterfront. This is our panel, just the construction of it, but the key thing is that we have different disciplines at the table, and we had an architect and landscape architect from Vancouver and Montreal. So we're trying to pull from the urbanisms that are really great cities in Canada and bring them to Toronto. And then what people don't realize is that it's really a lot of work, and it's a lot of administrative work, and there's staff at Waterfront Toronto who look after us, and they coordinate all of our meetings. It doesn't just happen. People are recording, the minutes are everything, and it's been a learning process for all of us. And yet, you know, even every proponent still has to get a site plan approved by the city. So it's a parallel process. We're only advisors. We only have our reputation and our ideas. We don't actually say yes or no. We vote on projects, but ultimately we advise the agency, Waterfront Toronto. They're binders. I have so many of these. I've been doing this for as long as Chris has been there. I've got a collection of binders of every single proposal. They're submitted well in advance. And you see different kinds of presentations. That's what's so fantastic. I can say I've seen the very best presentations ever. These are the 4 goals that are critical. Probably the last one, ground floor animation, they're all important, but that one's very, very important in terms of the call for urban architecture. And then just along the waterfront, this is just a real survey, but only a European would draw a double row of trees like that. I think that's what blew everybody away. They said, these guys must be from somewhere else. But they also proposed bridges over the slips. And so there's this interaction between reality and incredible drama and rhetoric and presentation, and always a wink at what it means to be Canadian. These are incredible projects of construction. And I asked one of the West 8 people to send me this just the other day, but I think this is what we get to see at design review. So just think about it, and we get to review and criticize even every aspect of their construction. So it's a material built world that we're involved with, but this is a brilliant piece of work, and it's won awards, but I just thought this was incredible. And of course, safety in Canada is everything. Only in Canada would they write a bylaw, you know, about railings, and you know, how would Amsterdam be if every canal had railings so you wouldn't fall in? And then these kind of drawings, look at these. These are amazing. These are the working drawings, and very, very well thought through. West 8, hats off. And I'm going to do this just by clusters of projects, because there are buildings and there are landscapes. They're all within the precinct plans. Everything that Chris has explained is in motion, and there's a kind of deep structure. But then things actually happen as developers come forward and as institutions come forward to build the plan. So you see the red dotted line, which is Sherburne Commons, which Greg Smallenberg's firm did. I show this because we rejected, he was a member of our design review panel, and he came in with this project, and it was rejected. And he was rejected many times, and to the point where he actually asked me if maybe he should resign. And I said, don't resign. They then came back with a series of iterations and kind of completely changed their approach. They were trying to do too many things. And what they ended up with is something that is clearer, simpler, and had better scale. And then Chris really argued very strongly for the continuity of the West 8 work. So you get 2 landscape architects. You get Phillips Farbag Smallenberg, and you get West 8 Dutoy Alsop Hillier in the east-west direction. It's fantastic. I'm telling you, you get the contact between high-level designers in different disciplines happening every month. We get these. So here's what Moshe Safdie came in first with. And I dreaded going to the first meeting because I didn't know what I was going to tell him. You know, this was a really dumpy building with, I don't know what was going on here. You know, it's all a kind of post-habitat. Although Habitat itself is one of the extraordinary projects ever. He then came back with this project, which was a mixed-use project of office buildings and then residential with the view, of course. He's using Smallenberg's park as context. Imagine the value that this gives this building. It's extraordinary. And then this is interesting because in design review, he went from a mixed-use building of offices and a very softy-esque kind of monumental end of what, you know, onto Queens Quay, to a total residential building. And this went through a lot of discussion. We have so many architects and landscape architects on the panel, but it's a very detailed look at buildings. We look at everything. This was an interesting issue where Bridget Shim felt this canopy along the park was just not strong enough. And this was a change that was recommended, that it would actually slide out between the piers of Safdie's building. And it's not easy because he's a high-ranking architect, and so you're telling someone who is really well-known what you think should be done with their building. And so it really depends. I would say everything depends on respect and a certain level of collegiality to maintain a discourse about the work in front of us. Claude Cormier from Montreal, he is importing a kind of a sort of way of looking at things that is European, and from Montreal, no one in Toronto would propose this. And these, everyone said these will fail. These will absolutely fail. No one will go down there. And guess what? They're really, really successful because he's seen them in Paris, he's seen them in Zurich, he's seen them in Europe, and they work in Canada. So it's a natural thing. And so then he did the pink ones out in front of the Chorus building. Also very, very highly visited and really pops out in the landscape. You can't get a seat out on his beaches. He wants to do a third one, which is called Whiskey Beach. He's got all these crazy names. He's got Sugar Beach, Whiskey Beach. And this was Jill Anholt from Vancouver working with Greg Smallenberg. So there was a public art component, but the public art would function as part of the larger scale sustainability of the park. And so our building, by the time we got to do our building, which is for a community college, it's a healthcare campus on the waterfront, we were responding to their park. And we wanted to be right on and really, quote unquote, own the park, even though the park is public. But the response to the landscape has been incredible in the media, the public domain. People have really responded. And so the phrase leading with landscape has really become critical to the way in which Waterfront Toronto sees itself operating. And these are beautiful. They're beautiful at night. People take people down, visitors, to see them. Steve Teeple did this very interesting take on a park pavilion right beside the pool. The pool is emptied in the summer, and in the winter people are skating on it. There's water sometimes. It's a variable landscape, but there's a concession and change rooms and washrooms, all the things you need in a park. But he made this really kind of funky shape. It frames views. You don't know what it is. It could be a hangar. It's an industrial building. So our building, there's our building, go back, which is for a community college of healthcare. This is the facade on the park. And what the idea of this building is that it's about interprofessional education where people are drawn out of the labs and classrooms, and we said drawn into the park. And so it's almost a section through a building that you can walk on from an upper level deck on the 7th floor down through the building all the way down into the park. And the park and the building, this building would not be the way it is without that park. I know that for sure. So we get to look at Teeple's building. And so this is what I like, this kind of collaboration over time between architects, landscape architects. This is our roof. And now these sites are coming up right now. There's a proposal call out for these sites. This is where Moshe Safdie's building will be built. And then in the West Don Lands, Gilles Saucier and Andre Perrot, they did this building. It was very, very difficult, but it may be the best work of architecture on the waterfront. But we're doing the Pan Am Games, and we have to always declare, like I do now, I have to always declare my conflict of interest. You can't be reviewing your own designs at design review panel. But Underpass Park, again, Phillips, Farvag, Smallenberg, but they brought in some younger emerging designers. Paul Raff did this very interesting mirrored ceiling piece. It's highly polished stainless, and it captures light even though it's just the ceiling. It's a very interesting work, and it's changed people's attitude about moving underneath these freeways. And this is Gilles' project, which the Underpass Park is underneath, ultimately, this Richmond-Adelaide freeway back behind these buildings. This is the river that we've been talking about so much. In the Urban Design Associates plan, these were just a kind of movement of buildings. What Gilles has done is they framed both sides, so they're dark buildings with these more crystalline cubic forms, and it's called River City. And I think he's managed to make a kind of eastern-facing gateway to the entire downtown as you cross the Don River, and it's under construction. It looks very good. This is another tower, so you have these freeways coming. So his problem was to try to make it continuous, even though the freeway would still pass through. And then there was another agency that was formed, which was all about public-private partnerships. So when you look at the West Don lands, you see the precinct plan that Chris talked about, the landscape in the public realm, Greg Smallenberg. Then there is the event of the Pan-Parapan Games, which are in 2015. And this is housing for 8,000 people with very interesting transitional uses. So this will become a student residence. It's easy to see athletes housing becoming a student residence. This will be rental housing. This is a condominiums. So it's a mix of tenure, ownership, institutions, heritage buildings. These are the only two heritage buildings that are being saved. This is a famous building called the Canary Restaurant. So the district is called the Canary District after the games. And it's being marketed right now. I mean, marketing and development for 8,000 bed spaces. It's pretty incredible, the scale of it. This will become a YMCA. It'll be the athletes' clinic during the games. And then all the buildings are designed by different architects. And I think part of the waterfront idea is that you would have different architects. It would be about diversity. And so that's what we've been trying to develop. And these are all within the very stringent built form rules, which we call the loaves of bread. There are these very defined building envelopes, but all of these sit within them. They just do it in different ways. And then looking back to the downtown along Front Street from Michael van Valkenburg's park into the Greg Smallenberg Front Street landscape with buildings by different architects all the way along. And in the winter, and this is it under construction. This is very recent. So there's the student residence in Athletes Village over the YMCA. There's condominium housing, more rental housing. And so all of this will be, this has been a very advantageous thing to actually be able to build out a precinct in almost one go. And then some of the really romantic pieces of Michael van Valkenburg's work. I mean, you really realize you're witnessing people who have done these kinds of large-scale transformations and successfully. And we were looking for that, and it's a great mix of talent, but it needs coordination, and this is where Chris, I think, has done a remarkable job. And then out here, which he never talked about that much, is about 1,000 acres of artificial land and water, breakwater. James Corner has done the plan for this park, which is extraordinary. And it's coming. I mean, it's in evolution now, but it's a very huge piece of artificial ground. And so this project of the waterfront, which I think is the project of our time, has been this moment in the history of the city where the local community, I think, has been very open to design. And I think that may be the larger advantage or the larger message, because it's operating in different ways than the rest of the city. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Bruce and Chris. It's getting a little bit late. I know some of you are checking your watches, and I know Broadway Market closes at 8:55, which is the last available protein in this part of the world. So, but what I thought we'd do in lieu of a discussion, because I've had plenty of opportunities to weigh in this evening and over the recent past. I want to thank both Chris and Bruce for coming, and also for giving us the backstory, because I've been doing the one-liner for a few years now, the front-end stuff. But I want to just open it up to questions for either of them from the audience. Please.
I came in a bit late, but I'm interested in, and maybe you already talked about this, but the transportation infrastructure is especially interesting to me. The Boston waterfront has a number of serious problems. With a Silver Line, which comes up at D Street and then does weird things, and they could have spent the money tunneling back when they did it the first time and didn't, and now there's a mess. People are trying to sort out some of what to do. I'd be very interested to hear a little bit about the public transportation infrastructure, the parking, because all of that ends up being really important.
You know, it is all really important, and we had a mayor, David Miller, who was our green mayor, who was a lawyer, aren't they all lawyers, and got onto the into Vanity Fair as one of the really progressive mayors, and he had a pretty good vision for the waterfront, and a lot of what we've been doing has been really under that momentum. But we then have, there's a new book that you've got to read. It's called Crazy Town, and it's about Rob Ford. And you can't imagine a different mindset to think about the waterfront. He's not interested. In fact, it was an election issue that he would not run the LRT along Queens Quay, and we need that LRT to get to that school, to get to those residents. And so all of it's been planned. I think Chris has done an incredible job of trying to keep the systems moving, and still try in the city as well to try to provide service, because one of the weakest aspects of living in Toronto right now is the public transportation system and the ability to get in and out of the city and along the waterfront. And so I think everything's in place. I think the planning's in place, but the politics and but we're in the midst of huge changes on the waterfront, and we don't even know what the final outcome will be. Like, we don't know maybe you know, but I don't know whether the Gardner will come up, be taken down, or go up. I don't know whether there'll be an LRT along Queens Quay. Right now, they're running shuttle buses from Union Station, which is also being renovated right now. Like, I've never seen so many parts of the city being worked on and being renovated. I've never been in Toronto where public transit and the failure of it in Toronto has been discussed every single day. Like, everyone is really tied up. It's probably the #1 issue in the city, just the weakness of our public transportation system. So we work hard at this pretty much. He works hard on it every day. I work hard on it every other day maybe, but it's so crucial to making a really healthy city. And Toronto, you would think, could show the way forward, but we've got a mayor that's a real problem for us. It's really a problem. It's no longer just some funny business that happens on Jon Stewart or David Letterman. You know, it's very real. So now everything is tied together: the politics, the planning, the economics.
Yeah, I would just add on the transportation. I think, you know, in some ways the big transportation agencies are their own worst enemies, because they like things to be really big when they do them and very expensive. So the transit project on Queens Quay that Bruce was talking about started off at I think $150 million project. It's now $450 million project because they're very ambitious about how they want to engineer the tunnels and the portals where it comes out, and they're all good things to do. There's no real question about that, but I think for them in the transportation world, there's an answer, and that's the answer they want. And finding the money, they kind of think someone else should really take responsibility for that. They see transit as a natural given, so we've come up with the best, greatest transit solution, so why don't you people go out and figure out how to pay for it? And, you know, that's sort of a noble approach in one way, but there's so many competing transit demands, there's nowhere near enough money to build all the transit that we need. The only other thing I would say as a cautionary note on streetcars is that, you know, I think when we get behind the idea of transit, it empowers the transit engineers to inflict a lot of damage on the public realm. I think that's been the case in parts of Toronto and maybe elsewhere. But very often those dedicated transit right-of-ways come at the expense of sidewalks, not at automobile lanes. In our system, lots of overhead wires everywhere on rusty, crooked poles, which are not, you know, great for the urban streetscape. And I think the biggest problem is because streetcar systems are slower and lower capacity, there's an effort to turn them into high-speed, high-capacity systems, which means they don't really want to stop them very often. So they don't really want streets going across them very often, which was the big challenge with our Queens Quay project. There used to be cars on either side, and if you wanted to get across, well, they didn't just let you get across. You drove all the way to the end, made a U-turn, and then drove all the way back to the driveway that you wanted to get to. You can't do that now with the configuration that we've put forward. So we had to put traffic lights in, and that was really the source of our battle with the transit agency. Was they don't really want to have to stop, to the point where I think they would really love it if they didn't have to stop to pick up passengers, because they could really achieve great speed and efficiency then. But
Chris,
you know, I worry that all the positive emphasis on transit that we all have runs the risk. I think of these high-speed streetcars in cities turning into the elevated expressways of our generation. So, you know, the one thing I will say for our strange mayor is he really believes in building subways, and you know, I think we need to figure out how to build more subways in our cities and fewer streetcars.
Chris, you're just reminding me that in the short time that I served on the design review panel in Toronto, I remember not every month, but every other month, a fiercely held debate, set-piece battle around, would it be possible to get smaller fire trucks? Because we've seen them in Europe. I remember the Dutch, you know, can we get narrower street widths? And always it was the garbage removal and it was a fire truck. And I tended to join the younger group that was arguing for smaller fire trucks until I woke up one morning in my condo in the middle of the night and looked out and saw an enormous fire on the block adjacent, at which point immediately I switched side and I wanted the largest possible fire truck I could get immediately. I think we have time for a couple more questions. Was there, maybe you want to appear? Yeah.
So thank you very much for the presentation. It was really interesting to almost see a lot of things we've been taught in this program as it unfolds in Toronto. So it was really interesting to see the kind of paradigm shift from the barricade of housing from the lake to this kind of embrace of the lake. And I was wondering if you can kind of talk about that and in terms of really the kind of like paradigm shift that you've been witness to, and how we can make that kind of change in a particular place to go from kind of really wanting a separation from a place or from a kind of force such as the water, to really deciding all of a sudden, okay, we're going to bring that right into the city as much as possible and put our neighborhood blocks surrounded by the lake.
Well, I mean, maybe I should check back with you in a few months when we've decided what to do with our elevated highway, because that's probably our biggest barrier, and the jury's still out on where we're going to end up with that. But you know, I think the experience of the buildings that went up in the 70s and 80s really shocked people, that there were suddenly things between the kind of main downtown and the lake view. And it's not entirely clear to me who was that upset about the loss of views. I think in some cases it was actually people driving on the elevated expressway didn't like the buildings because they couldn't see the water as they were driving in. And then, of course, the elevated itself blocks views to the water for pedestrians. So it's a complicated story, I think, as to what that sequence is. But there was a very definite desire to scale the development so that it did not appear to be this picket fence of towers all along the waterfront. And so that's what we've been trying to do, and done it with a community planning effort. But it's a challenge. It's an ongoing effort. I mean, Bruce raised the whole issue of how much can you regulate built form. We put in a very rigorous built form set of regulations, and they're challenged all the time. And they're not so easy to defend when you come to a sort of court of arbitration. So, you know, all this land use and planning stuff also has a legal aspect to it. And if you can't defend it in what's essentially a court of law, it doesn't end up working. So I think, you know, we've made some great attempts to regulate built form, but I don't think we've figured out the magic solution yet. But I think we had the momentum from what happened to try something different, and it's an ongoing experiment.
Well, I think it's not just about the lake. I think the evidence of what Waterfront Toronto's done is that the parks and the public spaces near the lake are the draw. People go to see Claude Cormier's umbrellas.
Yep.
They go to Sherburne Park. They go to Michael van Valkenburg's park. This is really kind of producing a series of places along the waterfront. You're not just there to look at the water. You know, that's what I think's been going on. The wave decks.
Yep. Yeah, those have been a draw in and of themselves.
Yeah, and so when it's all tied together, then I think we'll have something.
I mean, in my experience as an immigrant to Toronto, I found a generational divide in which there was a certain generation of urbanist architect who were really trained against the failures of our fathers, right, the failures of modernism, and had a deep-seated, profound, and well-felt anxiety about all that openness. And a part of it is explained in terms of climate, and a part of it is cultural heritage. And so what I've been so heartened to see in the last decade is that sorting itself out in favor of places that are dense, walkable, sustainable, and at the same moment have access to ecological health function and the benefit of the water. I think there was one up here. Yeah.
It seems like leading with landscape is a priority of Waterfront Toronto these days, and it's produced some pretty amazing parks along the waterfront. Is there a way that landscape can play a larger role in actually generating some of the built form, or influencing, being more of a driver of controlling the built form?
Well, you know, it was very hard to get the architects to move their front doors. That was about as far as I've gotten in that respect. I don't know. It's an interesting question. I've often thought about, could you define a street grid system that would actually define what the architecture is that ought to go on it? I think New York City's street grid, to some extent, does that. Obviously, there's a huge zoning code that reinforces it and always has, but I think it has led to a natural hierarchy of buildings to some extent. I don't know how to. I don't think I'm qualified to answer that question. Can landscape? I don't know. It's a great question.
I mean, again,
I recall. Maybe I'm just too tired. I don't know.
I wasn't in the room for meeting 50, but upstairs I have binders 1 through 38, I recall. And I can tell you in the first few years, it was kind of an out-of-body experience, I think, because you impaneled this amazing array of national, international talent, architects, and they were all looking at salad. It was like 2 years of looking at salad. It was like, can we get to the meat? And I think after a couple of years, I think it began to dawn on people that that's the meat. That's it. That's what we really have to weigh in upon.
I think the best example of that is probably Bruce's building. I mean, you responded to the park, not, you know, your building was designed by the park.
I think that's true. I mean, we actually had the same. I mean, Greg Smallenberg's, their firm is a very good landscape firm. So they were the landscape architects for the park, but also for our building. And so they were involved with the roof terraces and the landscaping that would sort of mediate our building, connect it to their park. Meanwhile, there's West 8 and the landscape of West 8, which our landscape architect wanted to change. So but Chris insisted. He seems like a nice guy, but he's really, really determined and obstinate and stubborn. And but he keeps everyone in line. And so there were landscape architect wars. We had the same landscape architect of the park in our building who loved the idea that our building would respond to their park. But we're also, what I like is that amongst at least my contemporaries in the design culture in Toronto, there's an incredible amount of discussion and everyone trying to one-up the next. I mean, competition is really healthy. And so everyone wants to do a better building than Saucier because they're very good. Everyone wants to do, something that makes a different kind of connection. And I think the key thing is for the system to be open and always calling for design excellence. That's what we've done. Even, the framework has been on the ground, but I think no one could have imagined it the way it's turning out. And you could say, well, it would have been better if, but that's not the way it is. And what's actually happening is really quite remarkable. And so you get everybody else's vision being laid on top of someone else's framework. And some of the frameworks have been adjusted. I mean, it's very difficult to keep it.
Yeah.
You're not Baron Haussmann. You just don't have that authority, and
No,
you've got
I don't
other
have any
tools.
authority actually. So
What's that?
I don't have any authority actually.
Well, you do. You always. I mean, I think you've probably done more to change the waterfront than any individual in the history of the city. I mean, that's what I think. I mean, there've been other commissions, but they weren't thinking in the same way. And I think they're game-changing moves at the level of the city, its relationship to the water. Within that, I think landscape design on our waterfront, I'd give it a 9 out of 10, 8.5, 9. West 8, I'd give them a full 10 for the wave decks. I think in architecture, we're 7.5, 8, 7.5. It's just not at the same level. And I think that's what we really have to do. We have, maybe we should have more competitions for the buildings.
Yep.
I mean, I'm always being approached by younger architects to, where are the competitions for the buildings on the waterfront?
Yeah.
I know that there are many, many other questions, but it is getting late. So what I'll do is I'll just say one brief word in closing, and I'll invite everybody down to scrum with Chris and Bruce and ask their questions. And I guess for me, what's particularly remarkable is the accomplishment in an open, free, democratic culture, with participation, with built form guidelines, but with design, progressive design culture. I mean, that combination that just seems so elusive for us in the States and doesn't seem very evident in East Asia in my travels either is a remarkable accomplishment. And so again, just thank you for being here and thanks for all you've done.
Thank you.